All right, we saved the best for last. Of course, we have Undersecretary Alan Estevez of the Bureau of Industry and Security, who needs no introduction. You've been very popular throughout this event, but don't worry, we're not talking chips at all. I think you mentioned that you've said about everything that you can possibly say in this domain on chips. But we also have Karen Dahut, yes, who is CEO of Google's public sector, providing DoD and other agencies with the technologies needed to stay ahead of the world's strategic threats. Karen has more than 25 years experience in technology, cybersecurity, and analytics, having also been Chief Technology Officer of Google Cloud and leading Booz Allen Hamilton's $4 billion global defense business and global commercial business sector. Karen was also an officer in the US Navy and served as a controller for the Navy's premier biomedical research institute. All right, so Alan, let's start with you. And you must be the busiest person in government right now, because in addition to all the export controls issues that we've talked about throughout this event, you also have something on your plate at the moment, which was courtesy of the last administration. I think in the waning days of that administration, they released an executive order on cloud, and you were tasked with implementing that cloud know your customer regulation. Can you talk to us a little bit about what is the purpose of that? How do you think about this as you're working through it, understanding that the rules are not yet out, but whatever you can say publicly?
Sure, a couple of things. First of all, I'm not the busiest person in government. I am busy, though. Second, Karen, it's great to be on a panel with you. Karen and I have been sitting on group discussions for like the last 6 months together in different venues, so it's wonderful to be up here. To your point, Dmitri, we did get not just the cloud rule, the whole ICTS rule, and connected software, and I will not talk about one particular connected software app, but all the others that are in our plate. That was given to commerce throughout the end of Trump and the beginning of the current president's administration, the Biden administration, and was given to BIS in March 22 with no money, which was a fun thing as I walked in the door to say, how am I going to do this thing? So on the cloud piece, and we just heard the cybersecurity panel talk about things like SolarWinds, which was done within our infrastructure. So the look was, how do we mitigate that threat, if not defeat that threat? Certainly mitigate that threat. I will say that I looked at the first draft of that rule. We put out a proposed rule a while back. There's going to be a new proposed rule coming out shortly. The draft that I saw of that, I said, this doesn't get at the problem. And we've done some recranking on that. We reached out to industry. We've had some good discussions with serious cloud providers on top tier, Karen's company, like competitors, down to a smaller version of that, working closely with the NSC and Neuberger on what the right mix is, and certainly working with the intelligence community. I think we have the right mix. That rule will be coming out in the near term. And it will be coming out for comment. So it's not going to be coming out as a final rule. It'll be coming out where people will get a bite of the apple to help us tweak it.
And is that 180 days to comment, 90 days? Can you comment? No. Okay.
I'd have to actually look.
Okay.
I couldn't even answer that if I wanted to.
Got it. And just to clarify, the goal here is that we saw that the SolarWinds actors, which was the Russian intelligence services, were using US cloud providers, and because the intelligence community has limitations in what it can do in the US, yes, it can use FISA process and so forth to get access, but it's slow and not as comprehensive as what we can do overseas. The goal is to make it more difficult for them to use US infrastructure for those types of operations. Is that right?
That's correct. Without impeding our companies from being able to do business in Europe or Asia or wherever else.
Yeah. So Karen, when I think about 3 revolutionary technologies of the last 20 years, I think it's been the mobile phone, smartphone, cloud, and now AI. You guys are a little bit involved in all 3 of those. But can you talk to us a little bit about Google's public sector, which you're the CEO of, and how you are thinking about particularly cloud and certainly AI, as it relates to government. We've seen tremendous change just in the last few months with ChatGPT coming out and people seeing potential of large language models. I was talking to Rob Joyce earlier about how the government could be using that. How are you thinking about providing that capability to the government?
Yeah, thanks, Dmitri and Alan. It's great to be up here with you as well. And I know we are between you and a glass of great wine, so I hope this makes it interesting. I'll start with Google and Google public sector, to your question, Dmitri. Google is a very proud American company, which we think has spurred incredible technology innovation across the globe. 30 years old in September. Hard to believe a company our size, scale, is only 30 years old. And it has 9, 10 products on the marketplace that have over 1 billion users. And we believe that that same experience that consumers have, that our government, our military, state and local governments, our education institutions should have access to that same type of technology and that same ease with which they can use technology. And the power of that is enabling that same technology innovation at scale across government. So last summer, we stood up Google Public Sector with the explicit idea of bringing Google technology at scale to the public sector, which is federal, state, local, education, and ed tech companies. Now, to your question specifically about shifts in technology and platforms, if you think over the past decades, to your point, platform and technology shifts like cloud, social media, mobile phones, have inspired whole generations of developers, of innovators to think about businesses and business models fundamentally differently. And AI is that's exactly where we are with AI today. That same idea of inspiring a whole new generation of innovation within an ecosystem and even more broadly. ChatGPT, Bard, Google's generative AI tool, has captured the imagination of the world. And I think we're not even able to comprehensively understand even 1 or 2% of what AI and generative AI can really do for the world. When you think about when the iPhone was introduced to the world, none of us would imagine we would use the iPhone today the way we're using it. And I think that's where we are with AI in general. The challenge with adoption and implementation of AI at scale for the federal government is not the failure of imagination. It really starts with a strong, modern infrastructure. We have to modernize the infrastructure, meaning moving to the cloud. And I know we're going to talk about cloud adoption, so I won't go there yet. But we need to modernize the infrastructure to be able to have the data infrastructure to really support AI and high compute to be able to get the value out of AI. And I think the promise is there, but we have to start at the beginning.
Well, let me just follow up on that, because on one of our earliest cyber panels, when I asked a question to Rob Joyce and Sandra Joyce about what medium and small businesses should be doing, the answer was move to the cloud. So how is the government doing on that front in terms of moving to the cloud to gain all the benefits of that technology?
So I think cloud adoption in government is nascent. I mean, we're very proud award winner of the Joint Warfighting Cloud Contract within DoD. There's 4 CSPs that have been awarded that vehicle, and we're super excited about the power of cloud for DoD. But it's in its infancy across all of government. And I think there are a lot of reasons we can point to for that. I already talked about modernizing infrastructure, et cetera. But here's the thing. When you think back to federal government IT, most of it is legacy. It's monolithic and vertically integrated. And the power of cloud initially was that you would have to modernize that entire legacy infrastructure to get the value of cloud. That is no longer true. Now you can digitally transform and leverage data from the legacy infrastructure and create APIs to leverage that legacy system, that it's no longer a rip and replace. So I think we are in the precipice of great modernization and great cloud adoption, but it's going to start with an understanding of infrastructure and modernizing the data infrastructure to be able to leverage cloud capabilities and APIs. I'll give you an example. In my former employer, one of my big customers was Toyota Motor Corporation. And back in the early 2000s, they decided, well before any of their competitors, that they were a data company. 70% of the price of the car, if you don't know this, 70% of the price of a car today is software, not hardware. The same is true for all of the mission systems that support our US military today. The vast majority of the cost of that is software. To Heather's point around tractors, who do you want developing that software? Do you want OEMs developing that software, or do you want great technology and software companies develop that software? So I think that's where we are, and that's the debate, and I think that's the opportunity for cloud.
One of the things I thought was so interesting in the context of the conflict in Ukraine, again, Rob mentioned that earlier, but I know you guys have been very involved in helping out Ukraine, but they literally upended their entire infrastructure, all these data centers on-prem, and moved to the cloud in a matter of weeks in the lead up to the invasion. So it shows you, obviously, that's a country at war, or was about to be a country at war, and we hope not to have those same choices, but it can be done very, very quickly, right?
Very much so. I mean, we're super proud of our work with President Zelensky and winning the Peace Prize from the Ukraine, but I'll give you an example even closer to home. During COVID, many of our state governments were really challenged with being able to deliver benefits to citizens, and unemployment benefits, assistance benefits, to citizens. And New York State, Wisconsin, many other states reached out to Google to, within days, not months and years, move those systems to the cloud. And again, you're not moving the entire legacy system to the cloud, you're moving the data to the cloud, creating APIs that citizens can engage digitally with the system itself, and they were receiving their benefits checks within days. And so I think you can move at pace and speed today where that wasn't available 10 years ago.
So let me just jump in. I have a couple of perspectives on this. First of all, I need to note that the people who are being held up from getting wine are us, because most of these people are actually drinking wine already. But we'll get to that shortly. First of all, the opportunity is great, both on cloud and AI, and you need to do first and then the other. I got to ask the question about some financial data and picture on trade by Gina Raimondo, my boss. And I looked at her and I said, well, unfortunately, the commerce systems aren't built for a commerce 21st century secretary, right? Which made her laugh. But it's unfortunate, right? And the tools are there. For me, it's getting the money to execute those tools. DoD has different problems. I mean, they have money, but they don't have enough money, really, to do all those things. But they have to do it. The difference for Ukraine, for example, is scale, right? The scale of the U.S. We used to talk about, hey, Britain did this. Well, Britain's the size of a couple of battalions of Marine Corps, right?
Well, Ukraine is probably bigger than the Commerce Department, right?
Probably so. But existential threat, there's lots you can do. We did a lot of things in acquisition in DoD with force and contact that are abhorrent to the normal everyday business, but you do what you need to do. But we have to think about light forces in contact all the time, quite frankly, in order to mitigate threats and get us to the next place. If I look at Indo-Pacific and how I would deploy and sustain a force as a former chief logistician of the Department of Defense, if I'm not building a cloud environment and AI to move my logistics, not the physical movement, but the data and the understanding, I am missing the opportunity that's going to win the war.
Yeah, I wanted to comment, Alan, on your point around budget and dollars. I think we're all aware that these budgets are very strained and constrained for that point. Most of the IT discretionary spend in government today is, I would argue, owned and controlled by two important constituencies: OEMs, original equipment manufacturers like Lockheed, GD, et cetera, and the integrators. My former employer, Matt's employer, wherever Matt is, and the
My
integrators.
former employer.
Yeah, your former employer as well. And the challenge we have with that is not that the dollars are being misrepresented or misspent. It's that they're not being leveraged to create the innovation dynamics that can happen inside of logistics, finance, mission systems, et cetera. And the reason for that is that government generally tends to think as new and emerging tech as experimental, rather than let's take this technology that has been proven inside of Google, Microsoft, and pick your technology company, and apply it to a challenge. Don't consider it experimental. Apply it and require that these large contracts that are owned and operated and driven by other entities have the opportunity and are driven to apply that technology into those mission systems. And I think that creates a dynamic between the budget and the mission that might actually resolve some of the innovation tension.
I agree. I mean, if you look at, we'll give you a chance to ask a question. in a
No,
moment.
I love this. I don't have to do anything. Please.
Yeah, if you look at what Gus Perna did in Warp Speed, in developing the capability so we could see from shot produced to shot and arm, which he essentially had to do in a decentralized system, that was using those tools. And again, there was existential crisis, so you do things that you take risk, calculated risk, and it worked out. And we need to do more of that.
So let me ask you, both of you, and Alan, maybe you for a moment can put your former hat on of DoD acquisitions. But Karen, you mentioned at the Reagan National Defense Forum that DoD needs to act much more like a startup and leverage these capabilities quicker. Again, I look at Ukraine, and yes, it's a country at war, but they put out this system called Delta, which is basically a website that is accessible by essentially every officer within the Ukrainian military, that is giving them a full battlefield intelligence picture of what is going on. People can go in and say there's a Russian tank on this road, and people are using this for targeting within minutes, right? And they built this literally in a matter of 12 months, right? And I think about the Pentagon, and it would take a decade or more probably to build a system like that. So Karen, do you think there's any hope that DoD in particular can move quicker and do what you propose and act like a startup? And I'm curious what Alan thinks.
100%, I believe it. I think the will to do it, I think, is what I sometimes worry about, is people have 2, 3, 4-year terms, and do they have the will to force the change as quickly as it needs to happen? But I'll give you an example. The Israeli Defense Forces, the 8200 specifically, they have a process.
That's their version of the NSA.
Yes, exactly. They have a process by which an innovation that happens in the field can be deployed and applied at scale if it works in the experimental piece. We don't have that capability in DoD today. We have OTAs and CRADAs and R&D efforts that are tremendous at demonstrating the application and experimental nature of technology. There's very little way to get that that experimental technology into the hands of warfighters, or pick your flavor of soldier, sailor, airman, because the programs of record are owned outside of that experimental function. So I think what I said at Reagan, and I hold true to this, is we need to find a way of immediately taking an experimental application that has been proven to work and applying it in a program of record, not making it go through the valley of death that one of the earlier panels was speaking of, but immediately applying it in a program of record. And I think that's the way to do it. And I think what Heidi Shue is doing in the department is trying to get at exactly that point.
I would agree with that. And look, the department can be agile when they need to do. You know, when Frank Kendall and I were the 18L and the deputy 18L, and we were focused on force in Afghanistan, we did exactly what you were talking about, Karen, right? try this out, send it forward, and they'll let the troops vote with their feet.
And that was a counter IED effort as well, right?
It was, but it's also the whole sensor network, things that we did to like integrate data and, leading up to Maven and things like that. So it's doable. I can talk about the defense bureaucracy ad nauseum. And again, you should really have Bill LaPlante up here rather than me for this discussion. The trick is, Bill understands it, Heidi understands it, Kath Hicks understands it, Lloyd Austin understands it. 5 levels down, sometimes I used to say we're speaking in an echo chamber here. So how do you break that culture down? And the way you do that is you allow people to take risk, and you encourage that risk, and then you stand behind, as the leadership, that risk that may fail. And you have to be able to stand up there and say, hey, so what? And beat me up, Congress, and but this is the way we win.
I think there's a lot of good news in this. In 2016, Ash Carter, God rest his soul, came out to Silicon Valley and said, I need a greater partnership with technology and technology companies in the technology ecosystem. And if you look at the amount of investment from the VC community that is now being invested in national security startups, it's 1,000-fold of what it was back in 2016. So I think there's really tremendous news. The responsibility we all hold, government, technology companies, VCs, PEs, academic institutions, as well as, I would argue, policymakers, have to be able to drive this idea from experimental technology to a program of record and enable those startups who have great technology to get into the ecosystem of a program of record without having to go through all of the experimental.
100% agree.
Yeah.
So that thing we were at Hoover, General Brown, Dave Goldfein was with you. We needed program managers sitting in that audience, not the aides of the people who were on assignment to Hoover. We needed PEOs and program managers sitting and listening to the art of the possible. Because I went out and called some of those companies to say, hey, I need you in commerce, right? And that's the way to start driving that capability, which DIU, of course, is part of that ecosystem.
But Alan, do you think that they have the full authority from Congress to experiment and do this? Because there's a lot of regulatory, baggage that's been created over decades in procurement processes that impede all of this, right?
There is and there isn't, right? There's always a way you can do it if you have the willpower to do it. It's the focus, and then, look.
Is it all about having really smart lawyers working with you?
You don't even need that to tell you the truth. You don't. The Department of Defense and Department of Commerce has lots of authority, right? If I had more money, I could do a lot more things than I'm doing right now. I just got to say that. If Dr. LaPlante right now is, as I said last night, he's worried about 155 rounds in the future, right? And 155 rounds are in the inbox right now because he needs to get 155 rounds onto a battlefield to make that $33 billion investment of destruction of the Russian army go to pay its dues and protect the Ukrainian people at the same time. Doing that and focusing on this little PEO down here becomes, all right, I got Sentinel, I got F-35, so you lose focus, so you give direction and you expect execution, and it gets lost in the drive. So you have really good program managers and you have others that are being cautious. And you gotta reward the people who are gonna take risk and experiment.
Karen, let me ask, thank you indeed. Karen, let me ask you, one of the things that's really interesting now is how embedded Silicon Valley more broadly is becoming, not just with government, but even on the defense side. And Alan mentioned the 155 rounds, artillery ammunition that Ukraine desperately needs. The government is going now to Silicon Valley and saying we need to think of new ways to manufacture the equipment that we need faster than the traditional defense contractors may be able to do. Has that culture shifted where the Silicon Valley that traditionally was very sort of cautious of Washington, it's a long sail, there's a lot of regulations and bureaucracies and standards you have to do, but now they're seeing both the mission and the capability on behalf of the government to actually move fast and it's becoming more of a deeper engagement than it's been?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a journey. I think it's been a journey, and it continues to be a journey. I mean, I use Google as the example. I mean, who would have thought 5 years ago that we have Google Public Sector, right? And a very mission-driven, mission-focused organization that has the support of the board of Alphabet from Sundar on down to really bring Google technology and the magic of Google to public sector. So, I mean, that's a 5-year transition that's happened. And I think the way many of us think about it, there have been really in modern history 2 experiences where industry, government, academia have come together to solve really hard problems. One was in the build-up to World War II. Think about the small little Louisiana boat company that came together to build that boat that allowed our men to, land on the shores of Normandy. The second is the space race, when we were at a real deficit of being able to develop, rockets that could get us to the moon, and we were able to accelerate and get there. Most of us in Silicon Valley are at our core patriots, where we believe in the power of this country, and we want us to be hugely successful. We don't want the circumstance to have to be a crisis when we come together to solve for the next great, American technology, whether it's in DoD or the civilian sector or whatever. So I think that desire to be a part of something bigger, to be a part of the mission, is taking root in Silicon Valley, evidence the VC funding that I was talking about and the youth that really want to be a part of the mission. I think we have a responsibility to be able to tell the why it's important that we do this, why it's important that Google stand up and have a public sector business. And I think when we do that, it's a really powerful message, and people really embrace it.
So let's get into AI for a second, because there is really just an absolutely incredible revolution that's taking place in AI. And I have to confess, I've been one of the bigger skeptics on AI, in part because I've been involved in that technology for 20 plus years, doing machine learning before it was called AI, and saw the power of it, but also saw the limitations. And one of the most amazing things that has happened, thanks, by the way, to Google and really the invention of the deep learning and the AlphaGo and DeepMind technology that you didn't just invent, but actually made public for the world to see. You've completely upended that entire industry that existed, by the way, long before there was an internet industry. It goes back to the 1960s. But just for everyone's benefit here, to understand what has just occurred that is just so revolutionary and fundamental, you've had algorithms that have been developed in 1960s, 1970s. They were called AI algorithms, but they were essentially optimization algorithms. The idea was that this data is too massive for you to actually determine what the answer is. So we're going to do our best at approximating that answer and find an approximate minimum or maximum of that data that you're looking for. And what you guys have just completely appended and said, no, with enough compute using cloud, we're actually going to look at everything. And we're going to find the real answer and get to much greater degree of accuracy than was ever thought possible. And you don't actually need all these fancy algorithms. There's still algorithms in AI, but really it's the compute, it's the storage, it's the cloud that completely revolutionized this entire industry. And we're now seeing the very early stages of what is possible. I mean, talk a little bit more about how you guys are thinking as the inventors of this technology of what you can do with it in the public sector.
Yeah, okay. So first of all, I think let's step back for a minute. There's the consumer view of what you can do, and it's everybody going on to Bard and asking, it to write a concise, graduation speech, or a birthday speech or whatever. So there's the consumer version, and that's what's lit up the imagination of, really citizens across the globe. But from an enterprise perspective, which I think is more of what you're asking, when you think about AI, and you think about, let's talk about productivity enhancements as one area where AI can have a tremendous opportunity. I mean, we've seen examples of where we are able to demonstrate within Gmail the ability to go in. I'm going to read. Bard, or Palm is the enterprise version of Bard. Go in and read my last year's worth of email from Dmitri, and summarize that for me and tell me the 2 things I need to do and write a response back to me. So that's just pure productivity enhancement, right? That's a simple, how does an enterprise really gain productivity from.
So this is really going to solve the massive unread email problem that I think all of us are dealing with, right?
That's right. So that's...
That might be the most revolutionary thing I've heard in 30 years.
Yeah. But then, we were talking to Rob Joyce earlier, and you start to think about AI within, the national security community. And you have a private corpus of data that is the most secure data, in the nation, and that's on the high side and highly secure. How do you enrich that data using AI and large language models from, sort of just the general intelligence base, the general corpus of knowledge, and enrich the national security data? And how do you do that? And imagine what you might be able to learn about the national security data as it's enriched using the large language models and data from a more consumer corpus. So I think those are just imagining how you can use the enterprise capabilities for productivity, for insight, for analysis, for tools, building a whole different set of tools to address, mission challenges that we have today. So I think, again, like I said when I opened, I think we lack, honestly, the imagination to imagine what AI can do, and we're going to have to learn our way as we go down this path.
Ellen, how are you thinking about this? Because you have enormous amounts of data that you're dealing with from an enforcement perspective. Can AI help you?
I was about to say that before you asked me that question, because that's exactly where I go. I have, again, 21st century Secretary of Commerce that's asking me these questions. I have tons of data, census data, some of which was public, some of which is not, trade data from other sources. I have data from the IC that helps me out in this regard. And I have analysts going each by each and trying to pin together, connect dots for me so I can understand. I don't want those analysts doing that. I want the dots connected, and I want them bringing me choices and things that I can do. And I think AI has all the power to help us do that.
And Karen, to use AI, as I mentioned, you need massive amounts of compute. So that means it's going to drive massive public cloud adoption across the government necessarily for you to benefit from this, because you're not going to put it on your laptop or your phone. I mean, you can query it, right? So do you see that this is going to be one of the major accelerators of adoption of the cloud in the government?
Oh, most definitely. Look, I think it goes to everything we've been talking about. First of all, it's putting it's application modernization in the cloud. It starts with that. And then it's the data infrastructure. Once you have those 2 pieces there, the AI, the capability of AI, and with the compute power in the cloud, is extraordinary. And that will drive all of that sort of adoption, but you have to start with the modernization of the infrastructure. You don't go from what we have today to generative AI in government, and so you need to do this in piecemeal. And one of the things that we've been talking about is how do you develop a roadmap for agencies and different government organizations. Here's where you are today, and here's how you can get to the future in a meaningful, stepwise way, such that they can see the path. Because right now, you talk AI to most organizations in government, and it's so far out in the future, they can't see the possibility of it. And we, industry, need to be able to show them the possibilities.
Well, and I think, it's a little bit like the internet, right? That, yes, you have connectivity, but it's not about connectivity. It's about the applications that you can build on it, the Google searches and Gmails and everything else. So you have to build the applications on top of this technology to really show the power. Alan, I want to go back to you because you spent a lot of time at this conference talking about the tools you have to restrict commerce for very good national security reasons. And I was actually struck yesterday when the representative from the Department of Defense, the guys that have fighter jets and aircraft carriers and missiles said that commerce is a sledgehammer. I thought that was really a remarkable way to characterize you, the BIS and the Commerce Department. But a lot of what you do, as you said to me privately, is also focused on enhancing the competitiveness of American companies and enhancing trade. Can you talk a little bit about that part of your thinking as you go about your mission?
Sure. And look, my part of commerce, sledgehammer, okay, I like it. But, selected sledgehammer, used thoughtfully, I have to say. But that's my part of commerce. Commerce writ large is about promoting American business and promoting American competitiveness. And so just like, we just talked about what I would use AI for, Marissa Lago at the Trade Administration has a different mission, who also needs to use that kind of data for understanding what's going on in the world, who's moving what to where, what's out there, and how should I be promoting and where's the opportunity, just like businesses do. I'll go one step further, Karen, to your point on showing the opportunity in government. If government doesn't move apace, and it'll never move the pace of the commercial sector, it is what it is. And we can try, but there's always going to be impediments to that. What happens is government is made up of people. Those people, in their regular lives, and even I have a regular life from midnight to 6 a.m., use tools that are out there in the commercial sector, and then they come into government and say, well, why isn't this as that? And so they create their own demand, which is a good thing.
Let me ask the last question to both of you, and we'll take some questions from the audience as well. But Karen, from your perspective, and Alan, from your perspective in government, what more can be done to enhance this interlock between the private sector and the government? What would you like to see from the government and vice versa?
Well, look, I think the government has the most interesting problems. It's one thing to solve for ad revenue. It's a whole nother thing to solve for JADC2. So I would like to see a much deeper collaboration with government and industry on problem definition, because I'm absolutely certain when industry, tech companies, Google, is presented with a really hard problem, we will solve that. And so this collaboration being less about a prescriptive contract and acquisition process and being more of a collaboration on a challenge that is being faced by government, that presents huge opportunity, and I think it would generate incredible outcomes.
So just so I can get the clarification from you, but right now the model is government thinks of a problem, they think of a solution, they put out an RFI and RFP.
And they write pages and pages and pages and pages of requirements.
But you would like a discussion of,
yes,
here's a solution we can give you that you haven't thought of.
That's right.
Is that possible?
It is possible. It's hard, but it's possible. Look, the most innovative agencies in government, let's use DARPA as an example, which I was fortunate enough to oversee in my past DoD job. DARPA has people come in and out for exactly the reason Karen said. Here's a tough problem. Well, I've been studying this, tool for this problem. What is cooler than coming in and tackling the most hard problem about that problem, right? Or the solution about that problem. So, and that's like a microcosm, that's a person. Can government have those discussions? Yes, they can. The trick is, when it comes down to it at the end of the day, buying something, there are rules that are set in law for good reason, and we need to use more flexibility, and there are flexibilities around those rules, right? Not everyone, I used to tell my folks, not everyone sleeps with the FAR underneath their head, their pillow. There are some people who do, and they can make any contract happen. But we need to make it easier. OTAs are a step in that direction, and we do need to have that dialogue with the private sector. You've heard me say it 15 times throughout today, to understand what the art of the possible is, to work with the private sector on what's possible solutions, and then when we get an idea about it from a government perspective, say, okay, now it's time to go execute.
The same question, what would you like to see from industry in this space?
Understanding.
Empathy?
A little bit of that goes a long way too. Because I'm always out talking to industry, I kind of hear, but I think, sometimes they understand and sometimes they don't. I think The big companies, it's easier because they become their own bureaucracies and they kind of get that. I always say going down to Silicon Valley, and I used to say this when I was the CFIUS rep, is that sometimes I felt like when I was speaking, I needed an interpreter. And I think giving us
They
that,
think so too, though.
I got that. Trust me, I got that. Right? And I think working together, I think, is important in that regard.
Great. All right, we have time for one question, so make it really good because, again, you're standing between us and drinks, so.
That's us and drinks.
Yes. So I can't really see, so please find the person that's raising the hand and give them the mic. Thank you.
Hi, Stephen Ellis with Reuters. I had one for Alan. Maybe a month or so ago, we heard some talk about tightening rules loosening some rules around what could be sold to Huawei below the 5G limit. What's the status of any changes there? Is there anything you can say about them?
Next question.
Okay, actually, I'll toss you one on AI then. So one of the things that's very interesting about the rules that were set in October is they affect double precision computing and chip-to-chip interconnect speeds for very high-end AI chips. But NVIDIA just last week released a China-compliant version of its flagship chip that still has lots and lots of AI development features built into it that are compliant with that. So what is it that Commerce is trying to restrict in terms of the development of AI in China? And should we expect any modifications or further tightening of those rules?
Like we set out some rules. Companies are going to do what companies need to do. We'll assess their products to see whether they're in compliance with those rules or not in compliance with those rules. Our rationale for what we did to try to restrict Chinese AI development is, we've been talking about the benefits of AI and the good things, that we also touched on the military applications here. Well, they're trying to do the same thing in military applications that we talked about. And using our technology against us is just an anathema to me and to others in the government from the president on down. So we're always going to work to protect. We're always going to adapt as things go on, too. Technology is going to change, and if we're not flexible to adopt, then shame on us.
So in other words, you're not resting on your laurels and saying my job is done, right?
My job is never done. And my successor's job isn't done either. I'm just going to leave him in a good place, or her.
All right, please thank this panel. It was really a fascinating discussion.